Carly, what you got?
Oh, wow.
Hi, everyone. Hello. So welcome to Dr. Dennis Doverspike. The people who don't know him, he graduated with his PhD here in 1983. And he then worked here from 84 to about 2020. So he was here for quite some time. So most people know who he is. He's currently also an adjunct professor at George Mason, but he's also president of Doverspike Consulting. He's doing business at HR Lighthouse, and also he's the chief consultant at Winfred Arthur Jr. So he's here today to talk about
Me.
No.
I'm meant to read the title. I took 1 year of Latin in high school, so Quis, Custodiet, Ipsos, Custodes, which translates to who watches the Watchman.
Yeah. Very good. That was very good. That was very good. All right. So my name is Dennis Doverspike. I wasn't, because my talk's way too long, I wasn't going to have you introduce yourself, but what the heck. I cut out a lot, but to try to keep it more realistic because I always have too much material, but tried to cut out a lot, but it's still pretty long. So, but anyway, I thought I'd let you go ahead and introduce yourself just so I know who's here. So we just want to, not a long introduction, but just your name and maybe what year you're in or what interests you. But we'll start with Jim. Go around. You know, I know Jim already.
Jim Diefendorf. I'm a 17th year, and I like organizational psychology.
Right.
I'm Madison Schaefer. I'm a 4th year, and I'm interested in human infusion.
Great.
Jordan Tangenstahl, 5th year, interest in coaching.
Nicole Baker, 3rd year. Yeah, a lot of interest.
All right.
Stephen Holthauser, 3rd year, interest kind of broadly testing, measurement, methodology.
Ben Michael, 1st year, deciding, solidifying interests.
All right.
Hi, Hemang Vaidya. I'm a 1st year MA PhD. I'm interested in IO psychology kind of as a whole.
I'm Lindsay Wilcoxon. I'm a 1st year master's student. I also don't know what my interests are yet.
Ben Cowan, 1st year master's student, and I am still open to some more different areas as well.
Annie Wincart, I'm a 1st year, and I'm single as always.
Hi, my name's Samantha Happenden. I'm a 1st year master's student, and I have interest in work-life balance and workplace equality.
We're good.
Lexi Gomez, 1st year, also figuring
Jared, 2nd year, field of IO in general, I guess.
I'm Carly French, 3rd year, emotional labor, organizational justice, and work-life balance, and some other things.
Okay.
Megan Fry, 3rd year, wide interests.
Why? It's okay.
Same way, 2nd year, interested in motivations, emotions, and also performance feedback in general.
Mariel Reynolds, 2nd year master's student, specifically interested in perceived organizational support and gender in the workplace, with many others.
All right.
I'm Katie Rosek. I am a 4th year, and I will also go with the wide interest.
Are you the first?
It's the way it's going these days.
What year are you, Jim?
5th.
Right. You're the fourth year. Right?
No, I'm
Oh, you're the 4th year too? Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay.
I got it started. We've gone too
Okay.
far.
All right. Oh, yeah, I forgot already.
I'm Dr. Thornton Lugo. My interests include organizational justice, diversity in the workplace, emotions, ethics, corporate social responsibility. So specific interests.
I'm Andy. This is my 29th year here at the University of Akron. So Dennis helped recruit me and bring me up. All right. So I owe a lot to Dennis. So I'm delighted he's with us here again.
I'm Rosita, 1st year.
This is our new faculty member. Did you meet her?
Yes.
Well, you know, Winfred had told me a long time ago about her, so.
Oh, really?
Okay.
I say sexual harassment and discrimination and stigmatization and gender, all that stuff.
All right, very good. Okay, well, let's see how this. So today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence or AI, or more specifically bias in AI, especially as it's used in human resources. So we already did our introductions. In terms of sort of my basic outline, I'm first going to talk about the basic, this idea that a lot of people seem to fear AI or technology, and how that's led to the regulation of AI. In case you're not familiar with it, but because I don't know how many people are, I'll talk a little bit about defining AI and how AI is used in hiring. And again, AI here is artificial intelligence, not adverse impact. So how AI is used in hiring. I'll then talk about some of the recent regulations that deal with assessing bias in AI and how you can assess bias in AI, and then how should human resources respond to this issue. So that's what I'll be talking about. Oh, I think I saw a note up there. We have to tell you that you're being recorded.
They know. I record them all the time.
Being recorded. And I want to give credit to Winfred Arthur. So Winfred Arthur and I developed this sort of talk together. And when I talk about our approach to AI, Winfred and I developed it together to use for the city of New York. So I wanted to give Winfred some credit. I also want to give ChatGPT some credit, just to since this is a talk on AI, there's parts of this talk that were actually written by ChatGPT. Now, I haven't updated it since, what's that day? I don't remember, April 1st, actually. So, ChatGPT's come a long way since then. But actually, I used ChatGPT to write some parts of this talk, including to introduce itself. I'm not going to read through the whole introduction because, like I said, my talk's too long already, but that was sort of, I asked ChatGPT to introduce itself, and that's how it introduced itself to you. So I don't know how many of you use ChatGPT, but I wanted it to introduce itself to you. So, I was going to say, because I said it initially, as we go along, if you have questions, just feel free to ask. If questions come in from the online audience, they'll be asked as we go along, so don't worry about it. Okay, so what I was going to start though with was really how does an aging baby boomer sort of get involved in what's often called, or become, some people refer to me as an expert, which I always dislike, but in the psychology of emerging technologies. And so I want to just talk a little bit about my history with technology. When I started in college, which was at John Carroll, I wear my John Carroll shirt today. When I started in college, some classes were still using a slide rule, because there were simple calculators out there, but they cost about $100, which was a lot of money back then. So some people still used a slide rule. By the time I graduated and got to Akron, we had advanced to these famous punch cards. I don't know if I still have it anywhere, but you'd punch your programs and your data onto these cards. You then take it to the computer center, then read it through a card reader. It would take all night, and then you get a printout back the next morning saying you had an error somewhere. And so then you'd have to spend another day, waiting to find out you had an error. So running something simple like a t-test or a correlational analysis might take a week, because you'd be turning in your cards and waiting all day to get your results back. But so I go all the way back to punch cards.
Look what I have, just for you. All right, everybody gets their own punch cards. I have punch cards here. I've got a whole stack, so you can always have them, all right? Everybody take a punch card.
I used to have file cabinets filled with punch cards.
I know. So this is a factor scores. This is really what a factor score kind of looks like, so you can see the punches. So pass that around too, but I want that back. That's important, okay?
One thing you can see is this explains a lot about the history of computing, because even after punch cards went out of existence, a lot of data files were designed to be rectangular and to be 80 columns. And so the punch card continued to influence computer programming even after there were no punch cards anymore. However, here at Akron, we actually had we had an Office of Navy research lab that I worked in, and we had a PDP 1110 mini computer, which is one of the first like mini computers. Now, they call it a mini computer, but these units are as big as a refrigerator. This isn't the actual computer I worked on, but it's very similar. It was very similar to the setup we had. You actually had to boot it up. You know, the term booted up comes from the old days. You had to physically boot up your computer by moving the switches. So I go back a long way. Also, when I was here in graduate school, I was very influenced by the work of Herb Simon. So I don't know if most of you know him. He won a Nobel Prize in economics, so you should know him. And Bob Lord, who was here for a long time, had worked at Carnegie Mellon with Herb Simon. Herb Simon, with other people at Pittsburgh and at Carnegie Mellon, sort of started the idea of looking at human information processing and computers as using human problem solving and expert systems and all that type of stuff. And so I was very influenced by the work of Herb Simon. So he impacted sort of my interest in technology and information processing and those types of topics. But then, we're skipping ahead. What really got me into sort of where I started doing what was called emerging technology was when Winfred and I developed a test for a company called People Answers. And we developed a test for a company called People Answers. It was a personality test. But we developed this test, this was when a lot of companies were just startups, so we never thought they would go anywhere. But they ended up giving it to anywhere from 5 to, in the end, 20 million people. So they gave this test a lot. It generated a lot of data. But one of the things that happened as it was being administered is that people started taking the test on what was at the time called mobile devices or phones. So instead of taking the test on laptops or on desktop computers, people were taking the test on mobile phones even before there were apps to take tests on mobile phones. And this led to a lot of research that Winfred and I did that for People Answers on what happens when you take tests on devices that the test wasn't necessarily intended for, like mobile devices. And also a former graduate student of mine here, Matt O'Connell, went on to do Select International. Oh, can you back up? Yeah. Who went on to do Select International. He was doing a lot of game type exercises on computers. So we got involved with him doing reports and chapters on emerging technologies. So that's how I sort of got into emerging technologies, or what's called emerging technologies, as all this took place over time. I will say I'm not a programmer and IT person myself. If you ask me about like programming side of AI, I know nothing. So programming or the IT side is certainly not my thing. Okay. So that's just a little bit of introduction. And now what I'm going to talk about is really this idea of why we got to the point where we're regulating artificial intelligence and sort of the fears and that there's these certain dangers in artificial intelligence, because that's really our problem or topic for today. So I took out a lot of slides that I had in here that built up to this, but probably most of you, I hope, are aware of this. If not, you can just say you're not. But there's been all these calls for like slowing down or a halt to AI. That AI is expanding too quickly. There were a number of experts who got together and they did a pause AI letter where they called for an AI hiatus. And they said that powerful AI systems should be developed only once we are confident that their effects will be positive and their risks will be manageable. So, and you still see this probably today, that there's people arguing AI is just advancing too quickly. Of course, this isn't a new idea, right? It goes back to ancient Greek or ancient Rome, that this fear of technology and fear of computers, robots, AI. This is just a statement from President Biden about AI. So the Biden administration has weighed in that they're committed to that balance from addressing bias in algorithms to protecting privacy and combating disinformation. And there are a number of countries that have already banned GPT and sort of banned AI. Most of those are countries that you see as pretty totalitarian, like, such as China, but Italy is one in Europe that has at least put a temporary ban on GPT and AI. And of course, as I said, a lot of this goes back, there's long been this fear of singularity. It's been the theme of a lot of different sci-fi movies, from Battlestar Galactica, Terminator, iRobot, whatever this says in Greek, Latin, going back all the way to ancient Greece and Rome, that, that AI will lead to this singularity phenomenon. So really, this fear of AI is not new. I mean, the fear of technology is not new. Every time we get a new technology, there's people who go out and do articles on anxiety or fear of that technology, whether it be when they first came out with OpScan sheets, or of course, when we first started doing testing on computers, there was this, people's test scores are going to be impacted because they're afraid of computers. So, but that opens up an opportunity for psychologists to do research and publications on the fear of these different technologies. I threw in at least a couple of research ideas slides. I mean, if you're looking for research ideas, of course, a basic research idea is just, what is this fear of artificial intelligence, or is it really just anxiety over AI? What does this fear of AI lead to? Does it affect test scores? I think a big question is it different by protected group status? I think another question is, do we think, for example, AI is more biased than human decision makers? Because your choice is either human decision makers or AI. So how do you think AI compares to human decision makers? But you can look at antecedents of this fear of AI. You can look at outcomes of this fear of AI. And then I think a topic people will be researching is, one thing that comes out of AI is that the laws are saying you should be able to opt out. So by opt out, I mean that when you go to apply for a job, you'll be told that you're going to be hired for this job based on AI. And you're going to be able to say, you're going to have to be given the choice as to whether you want to be considered by AI for the job or by some alternative means. So whether you want to opt out. So if you look at the New York and other laws, you have to have an opt-in, opt-out decision. How are people going to make that decision? I wonder about that. How are people going to make that decision? What factors are going to drive why certain people might opt in or opt out? Are they even going to understand the decision they're making in terms of opting in or opting out? So,
is there current knowledge on just outcomes when someone does opt in, such as maybe some bias against individual and their decision to opt out of AI being used in the hiring process?
Are you saying, will there be bias because they do opt out?
Yeah.
Well, that's probably always people are going to think that, right? I mean, I imagine people are going to think that, like with anything else. Well, if I opt out, they're going to say, well, this is a lot more work and money for us to consider them for the job. So if I opt out, I'm going to look like someone who's not a team player, doesn't want to get along. I mean, that shouldn't happen, right? But I'm sure that's going to enter into people's mental state as they decide to opt in or opt out. I mean, even if you look at what New York says you're supposed to post online, I don't think the average person is going to be able to understand the data that's being posted online and use it to make any kind of decision. But there really hasn't been research yet because it's a new topic. But it's a potential research topic in terms of how people make this decision. Okay, so I'm slowly getting to where I'm going today. So there's this trend towards the regulation and auditing of AI. And that's where I'm eventually going. And so that brings up a lot of different questions. Some are more general, some are more specific. You know, we could start by saying, how do we define what is doing good for AI? So people say we should only use AI if it does good. But then, of course, how do you define doing good? And, you know, maybe if you're a priest or a minister, you can define doing good. But how do we define doing good for AI? Similarly, you could say that AI should be ethical. But, you know, that's sort of the same problem. How do you define what it means for AI to be ethical? That's beyond me. Now, maybe some of you would like to consider this problem and get into it and contribute to it in terms of how do we define what makes for ethical AI. I'm sure people in business schools will be considering this problem. How do we define what's doing good and what's ethical for AI? I don't have an answer to it, but you know, that's sort of the first part of the question. But that leads to sort of the more specialized question that is that AI can be biased. And so then we can say, how can we determine if AI is biased? And more specifically, the question that interests me and that I look at is, how do we determine if employee selection decisions made based on AI are biased? So I'm primarily concerned with employee selection decisions and how we make then, and how we can determine if those employee selection decisions are biased when they're made by AI. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. How we determine if employee selection decisions made by AI are biased. But before we do that, I want to talk a little about, in case you're not familiar with it, defining AI and how AI is currently being used in selection, what it is and what are its applications in HR, more specifically in hiring, onboarding, and selection. So again, ChatGPT wrote this for me. I asked it to define AI itself, and it said, you know, it refers to the development and use of computer systems and algorithms that can perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as understanding natural language, recognizing images and patterns, making decisions, and learning from experience. And most people break that up into 4 different techniques: machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, and robotics. Now, there is some use of computer vision. If you're familiar with the company HireVue, they're the ones who do the interviews. You know, certainly they have some use of computer vision, but most of it is concerned with machine learning. So most of what we're going to be concerned with is machine learning versus these other ones. I got to stop touching the screen, I guess. Yeah, the screen is too smart for me, that's for sure. So, you know, again, we could ask them more specifically, what is machine learning? It's a subset of AI that involves the use of algorithms and statistical models to enable computer systems to automatically learn from data and improve their performance on specific tasks. Normally, again, don't ask me questions here because I'm not an expert here. I don't really do this, but you use large data sets to train your system so that it can see patterns and relationships in the data. And then there's different types of machine learning. There's supervised learning, where the algorithm is trained on a label database, where the correct outputs are already known, and the goal is to learn the mapping between inputs and outputs. There's unsupervised learning, where the algorithm is trained on a non-labeled data set, and the goal is to discover hidden patterns or structure in the data. And then there's reinforcement learning, where the algorithm learns to take actions in an environment in order to maximize a reward signal. So those are the basic 3 types of machine learning that we deal with. And again, for selection, we're primarily limiting ourselves to machine learning. Okay, but so then how is AI used in hiring itself? Well, there's a number of ways AI is used in hiring. The 5th is really more a question than a way, so there's probably 4 ways. The 4 ways are recruitment and resume screening, video interviewing, pre-employment assessments, and predictive analytics. This is just my breakdown, but that's the way I would break it down into those 4 uses of AI in various kinds of hiring. But those are the 4 ways we're going to use it. Yes?
So it's always something that's like already been organized, like AI can't do like real time something?
Oh, sure, it can.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it can. You know, I mean, again, when you talk to the organizations that are doing it, there's differences in terms of, and I'm probably not going to use the same language, the right language, as to whether you freeze the learning or not, and whether you freeze it for certain periods of time. So, in other words, it can keep learning and adapting all the time, or you can sort of freeze it, so it stops learning. So, I mean, it stops learning for a while and just stays at a steady state for a while. As I understand it, as I understand how it works.
So if you train it, then you can stop it from learning more, right?
Right.
It's like doing a validation study where you get weights for your different predictors, and then you use that in the future selection context.
Yes. Yeah, and so you can freeze it that way if you want, or you can just allow it to, but I think, and that I think is the way most, I don't want to speak for most consultants or assessment firms, but I think that's the way most of them do it. But there are a couple of firms where it's constantly, learning and changing the weights as it goes through each selection decision.
Interesting.
Yeah, so. As you can guess, that makes it a lot harder to know exactly what it's doing. I mean that's one of the problems with AI. You really don't know what it's doing at heart, at the center of it all. You can't know what it's doing. Okay, so AI in recruitment and screening. There's quite a few ways we can use AI in recruitment and screening. We can use it to, of course, create recruitment campaigns, marketing. A big way it's used is resume or application screening. So I think, if you were to apply for a job today, probably the most likely encounter you would have with AI would be that it would screen your application or your resume that you submitted. So the AI would decide whether you move on to the next step. It can do what's called sourcing. That's where it goes out and identifies passive candidates who may not be actively looking for a job. It searches through social media and tries to get you to apply for jobs. There's candidate matching, where it can compare job descriptions to candidate profiles and find matches. And then, of course, you've probably all experienced there's various chatbots and virtual assistants that you can interact with as you're applying for a job or buying a car or whatever it may be. You can still run into chatbots or virtual assistants. So one way AI is used, probably a predominant way right now, is this during recruitment and screening, particularly the screening of applications. I have a slide later on. We'll come to the one sort of settlement that the EEOC has reached with an organization with regard to AI has dealt with applications, with the screening of applications. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Of course, then there's HireVue, and HireVue bought our friends at Modern Hire, and there were a lot of Akron grads at Modern Hire, but Modern Hire is now, whatever they say, a HireVue company, and so the HireVue is the one the company or assessment firm people usually point to in terms of video interviewing. You can use AI in video interviewing. It can do facial and vocal analysis. It can do emotional analysis. It can personalize and choose questions. And of course, it can evaluate and score the interview. So it can create an interview. It can score the interview. It can score things that humans typically would not be able to score in an interview in terms of facial and vocal analysis and emotional analysis. And so this is another common use of AI, is in video interviewing. Video interviewing probably is in sort of its own box, because probably people, I don't know that there's data on this, but I'd probably say people object to video interviewing more than anything else. I mean, it was one of the early types of uses of AI where there was regulation. The state of Illinois passed regulations dealing with video interviewing. So video interviewing is sometimes put into a different sort of box than other types of uses of AI.
I'm curious how even like collecting data like your facial expression or your voice or your emotions could actually be used to inform hiring decisions. Like, you know, can companies actually map that onto like requirements for the job?
Well, you don't need to worry. Well, I mean, we could go back and say you don't need to worry about requirements for the job, right? You just have to worry about whether it predicts. I mean, just from an AI perspective, whether it matches any requirement of the job is sort of irrelevant. I mean, I'm not saying from a good HR or good IO perspective, but I'm saying from a strictly from an AI perspective, you know, whether it matches the requirement of the job isn't probably. I mean, it can be part of what AI is considered, but doesn't have to be. Just whether it predicts.
So is it trained on, you know, I guess, I mean, we look at it as they're trained on good job performers and bad job performers and the video characteristics that differentiate them?
I won't speak to how HireVue does it, but yes, that's what you could do.
I mean,
yeah, that would be the simplest thing you could do.
It's trained on.
It's trained on good and poor job performers. Okay. So I can think even, was anybody here when Core did something where we went through and made lots of decisions for some company? Probably no one was involved.
I think I did
you
something, but it was an NDA, so I don't really know anything, but
right.
I
it was an NDA,
I
so
definitely researched AI.
It was an NDA, so you're not allowed to say anything, right?
There we go. We threw you right under the bus there. Who was in here and did that? And she's like, me, not me. Right? That's great.
And so, I mean, if we go back, there can be supervised learning when you know certain outcomes, and there can be unsupervised learning where you don't necessarily know the outcomes. So. And then you can use it in pre-employment and promotional assessments. So of course, you know, if you worry about IO jobs in the future, you can, I think there's still going to be just as many IO jobs in the future, but you can use it to create assessments. Of course, you can use it to score assessments, and then probably the way it's used most right now is to find algorithms to combine assessments. So you can use AI to find the algorithms to combine your assessments, which is similar to using regression, I think, as Jim said before. As a matter of fact, again, the New York law talks about computational methods. You can see regression is sort of a very simple form of AI, right? And regression is just a simple form of AI. You can use algorithms, AI, to combine your assessments to make your predictions, various forms of AI in pre-employment or promotional assessments. But you can also use it to create assessments, to write items, to of course score the assessments.
Dennis?
Yeah.
About rating items?
Yeah.
If you're using ChatGPT,
right,
who technically owns the items?
Oh, you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to say that I don't know what ChatGPT's limitations are. Although I will say this, I mean, I do know a little bit. I mean, technically, you're not usually, you know, there's a difference between, I'm not a player, so I'm not doing legal, but there's a difference between trademarking and copywriting. And usually individual items aren't necessarily copyrightable. It's the way you're combining them into a total assessment or, you know, because I mean, let's face it, most big five instruments, everybody's asking, do you work hard? You know, do you keep a clean desk? You know, the questions are exactly the same on every single big five instrument. You could argue the only distinction is sort of how you're exactly scoring them and how you're putting them together into a total instrument. So you could, you know, you could get into legal arguments about whether you can even, somebody owns a single item, but in terms, that's a great question in terms of a ChatGPT create your items. One I don't know the answer to. So I picked John Carroll because I went there. I think, Jim, you have a son right now, yeah?
He graduated.
Yeah, so you probably know, maybe you don't know this, John Carroll probably puts more coaches and administrators into the NFL than anybody. Last week, I think it was, the Chargers played the Cardinals. Both teams were coached by former John Carroll coaches. So both NFL teams had former John Carroll coaches. And I gave this version of this talk at Carroll, so I used the Carroll example. So we can use AI. A major use of it is predictive analytics. that's where it's sort of like what Andy was talking about. We look at current employees and we find an algorithm to predict who will be successful. So, and of course, we can either use intrinsic attributes, which I don't think a lot of people would have a lot of issues with, or of course you could use extrinsic attributes. So this is just a, for example, AI might find that if you want to find the best NFL employees, they should be a John Carroll graduate, 3.2 GPA, played a sport in high school or college, of Irish ancestry, and a practicing Roman Catholic. That might be what the profile looks like. Now, of course, a lot of people might have issues with using that profile as to whether it, violates the Civil Rights Act, whether it's using demographic factors that it should not be using to make decisions. But, that's the basic idea of predictive analytics. You're finding patterns in the data that lead to the prediction of successful employees. Okay, so that then leads us to the issue of bias. And so people, of course, then argue, if you look at that last example, that AI systems can be biased and they can be discriminatory, especially if they're trained on biased or incomplete data, or if they reflect the biases of their creators. So the argument is it's important to ensure that these tools are designed and used in a fair and unbiased way. And so how do we then define and measure bias? Well, that's where we come in, or why we continue to have jobs. As assessment experts or a psychologist, we actually know a lot about bias. We know a lot about how to assess bias, how to determine bias, how to do statistical tests for bias. So we know a lot about bias. So, we can contribute, hopefully, to this discussion of our AI systems bias. Okay, so that's going to bring me to the New York City law. Are any of you familiar with this? New York City law, the New York City regulation. It went into effect last January. So there's been a lot of attempts to regulate or audit bias in AI decisions in hiring. As a matter of fact, I think it was in June, I stopped trying to keep track of all the current regulations. Until June, I was keeping up on all the current regulations. In June, I gave up. There's just too many states trying to pass regulations that are dealing with regulations regulating AI. But probably other than Illinois with interviews, the first place to do it was New York City to pass a law that tried to regulate the use of AI in employment. Most recently, California passed a big law. But now California's law is a little different because it covers all AI. I mean, it covers, for example, AI used to make loan decisions, housing decisions, whatever it might be. So California the governor just signed into effect or into law a big general law dealing with the regulation of AI. But New York City's law specifically deals with employment decisions. And also, of course, the Department of Justice and the EOC have issued technical guidelines or technical guidance on the use of algorithmic decision-making tools. Interestingly enough, they were mostly concerned with bias against individuals who might have disabilities. So they were interested in, you can see where this interest would come from. Like, for example, if you have a disability and you're taking a video interview, I mean, how does it fairly score someone who's disabled and is taking a video interview? But the DOJ and the EOC have issued guidance. The White House issued a statement. The European Union is looking at enacting a proposed Artificial Intelligence Act. And as I said, I was thinking originally I was keeping track and had slides, all the recent regulations, but there's just too many now. It's just gotten out of, way more than I can keep track of in terms of how long the list is of different states and jurisdictions thinking of regulating AI and AI decisions in hiring. Well, here's the California law. It was signed September 6th. As I said, that covers AI very generally. Also, just recently, EEOC settled its first AI hiring bias lawsuit. This is what I was talking about earlier. I don't know if you saw this. It was a group, I'm not really familiar with them, iTutor Group. They provide English language tutoring services to students in China. Apparently their AI or their software would reject any female applicant over the age of 55 and any male applicant over the age of 60. So it was basically any older applicant who applied was screened out by the AI system and rejected. Well, they weren't invited for an interview is what happened. They weren't invited. I guess someone found this out they resubmitted their resume or their application and changed their age when they got the interview, when it was exactly the same as what they had submitted before, being overage, and so they probably went and complained to the EEOC. But this is supposedly the first AI hiring bias lawsuit. Although, again, it's not really a lawsuit. It was a settlement reached between iTutor and the EEOC. I'd also say this doesn't apply here if you're interested in aging issues. Of course, there is a question as to whether the Age Discrimination Employment Act applies to applicants or not. There was a court case that says it doesn't, that it only applies to employees and not to applicants. Oh, you'll have to get rid of that again. But nevertheless, the EEOC says it applies, and they reached this agreement. But so you can see again what the concern people have with bias in AI. For whatever reason, the AI system had decided that if you were over 55 or over 60, you weren't going to get an interview. Now, I also wonder if it was really AI that decided that, or some human being somewhere that told the AI to do that, but this is the case that's cited. Also, I think it's interesting that the concern is more with selection and hiring more than recruitment. I mean, I think you can do a lot more damage in recruitment than in selection and hiring, but there's been very little concern with recruitment, and most has been with selection or hiring. Also, of course, this tends to happen. The concern has been with outcomes more than with accuracy or validity. So there's not many people out there saying, are these AI systems accurate or valid? Well, most of the regulations are just saying, do they result in bias? And aren't really necessarily concerned with whether the AI systems themselves are accurate or valid. Okay, I'm not going to read this all to you. This is the New York City regulation. New York City passed a law saying that any organization using AI in employment had to post to their website a notice that they were using AI. They had to post all their results broken down by protected class. They had to do a bias analysis and post the results to that same website, and they had to give people the opportunity to opt out. So New York passed a pretty, you'd probably say progressive law that requires employers to do a pretty complete bias analysis and post all the results on the webpage. Now, whether people can read or interpret what's posted there, that I'm not sure of, but they said that they had to do this. What's interesting is they didn't use the terms AI. They used the term AEDT, and AEDT is an automated employment decision tool, but it's any computational process. So assessment firms and companies and consultants were all concerned that that would include regression.
Right.
Yeah,
It's an algorithm.
Yeah, that any computational process would include regression. It wouldn't be limited to AI. And so there was a lot of debate. I sat in on all the public meetings with regard to this law, and there was a lot of debate about these issues about how do you define AI and what's the difference between AI and an AEDT. Yeah, sure.
Did this law deter businesses from using AI as a selection tool?
I don't think so. I mean, we'll get to what have organizations done. One of the problems that the city of New York passed this law and didn't really think about well, I would say they didn't think about how are we actually gonna put this into operation? Who's gonna monitor it? How are we gonna develop rules and regulations corresponding to this law? So it took a long time. I think it actually went into effect around March or April was when it finally went into effect, March or April of this year, requiring companies to keep the data. I think the attitude of most companies was, well, we're going to talk to our lawyers. And we're going to listen to our lawyers as to whether they say we have to abide by this, follow this law or not. Although, again, I think most organizations were going to try to follow it. But the question, the organizations, or what a lot of organizations were arguing was, well, we'll follow the law, but what we're doing is not really AI, or not really even AEDT. So because we are using, we're not replacing human decision-making. We still have human decision-making. So it doesn't really meet the exact rule of the New York law. But.
So they're sidestepping.
Well, no, I mean, again, you're going to get the lawyers involved, and the lawyers are going to decide how they're going to interpret the specific law. But what the New York law calls for, which I don't know who teaches selection now, but if you took selection, you probably learned about, adverse impact analysis. It calls for a bias audit, but a bias audit, the bias audit it's calling for is really nothing more than an adverse impact analysis. So they call it a bias audit, but it's really, as you can see, it says, but to assess the tool's disparate impact on persons of any component one category. The component one categories are all those typical EEO protected classes, race and sex classes. So it calls for a bias audit to be done every year on the results from the artificial intelligence decision making. But again, if you're a consultant, that's good news, right? Because it also requires that this be done by an external consultant. So the companies and the assessment or testing firms have to go out and hire external consultants to do this bias analysis. Although, again, there's, you always get the lawyers, oh, what really is an external, expert or consultant and stuff like that. So basically, that's the New York regulation. A lot of people are probably going to model after that. What's tricky about it is it uses the term computational process. So it's not just AI bias, but non-AI bias, non-AI based decision tools would be included in this New York law. And of course, the big concern, though, of people, why they passed this New York law is just a concern that tests and selection have traditionally been biased against African Americans, and that AI was going to continue that bias against African Americans. I mean, when you sat in on all these public meetings, that was the clear message, that we know their testing and assessment is biased against African Americans. That's going to continue with AI. It's just going to be another way to keep African Americans out of jobs, and we don't want to do that. So that was the main concern. The main concern in New York City was with the hiring of minorities, that there'd be discrimination, in particular African Americans, and so a desire to keep AI from doing it. Okay, any questions there before I go on with this? Go ahead.
This is kind of like a half thought that just came to me, but in like the larger political context that we find ourselves in our country, New York and California, we kind of associate them on one end of the political spectrum or the other. Could you see the other side doing something maybe more against regulating AI, saying like, end of the free market, like let's keep it going?
Well, not regulating AI. I mean, for example, there's been a big controversy in Texas, right? Because they banned DEI, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but no, I don't think so. I mean, I think if you look at it, there's this fear of AI, regardless of your exact political view. there seems to be a common fear of AI. And so a lot of states, again, states and jurisdictions are looking at regulating AI in different ways, just because there's this general fear of it. But we can go back to then, how do we define bias? Now, again, I'm an Iowa psychologist, so one definition of bias is, of course, outcome oriented. That's the New York City approach. It's, let's look at the numbers. Who do we hire? Do we hire minorities or not? Do we hire women or not? Do we hire older workers or not? And I'd say that's the human resource industrial organizational psychology, EO focus. The other, which, this sort of gets beyond my programming abilities, is black box focus. Now, these are attempts to look at bias in the black box itself. So to try to identify bias as it occurs in the machine learning, in the internal workings of the AI-based decision maker. So, and there's a number of ways to do that. I mean, there's a huge IT literature or AI literature that deals with black box focused approaches. There's people who have data sets out there that you can input into your AI to see if it's biased and things like that. This is beyond me, this black box focus, but that actually looks at the internal workings of the AI. Of course, that's pretty tough to do too. So bias as an outcome-oriented approach. This is the approach that Winfred and Arthur and I came up with for doing analysis under the New York City approach. Basically, we start by saying we assess for adverse impact based on protected groups. So, as I hope you know, that's really subgroup differences, not really necessarily bias. If you want to use the psychometric definition of bias, as Iowa psychologists, we have a different psychometric definition of bias that's not the same as subgroup differences, but you assess for adverse impact based on protected groups. That's sort of step one. Step two would be to say, is the algorithm valid? Does it predict the desired outcome? Now, I think somebody asked a question about this before. Surprisingly, there's less evidence of this than you would think. I'm sure the IT people would argue, well, I know they would. They would argue, well, it has to predict the outcome because that's what it's designed to do. But then if you ask, well, do you actually have evidence, like a validity study that says, yes, it's predicting outcomes, they don't have that. They don't have necessarily validation studies that show that the algorithm is actually predicting some desired outcome. Then we could go through this sort of traditional bias or fairness analysis. Is the algorithm equally valid for different protected classes? Is the algorithm fair for different protected classes? And of course, well, once you get to fairness, now you're putting in value judgments. So different people can have different definitions of what actually constitutes fairness. But this was the approach we came up with. In terms of using it, basically assessing for adverse impact, classic assessment for adverse impact, looking at whether the algorithm is valid. Do they have validation studies that show the algorithm actually predicts outcomes? Do they have studies that show it predicts equally well for different protected classes? Although again, as I said, it's pretty common, I would think, that they haven't necessarily gotten to stage 2 and 3 yet. Although I would think probably if I was debating an IT person here, they would say, well, how can it be anything but valid? Because that's how it's designed, to predict the outcomes. I don't know if you're familiar with DCI. They're a huge firm, they do a lot of litigation work, a lot of consulting work out of Washington, D.C. Anyway, they've been doing a lot of work also coming out of the New York law with assessing bias in AI. They have a 4-stage process. They go through a discovery phase where basically they look at They go through a discovery phase. That's sort of like an initial phase of analyzing the AI. Then they go through an audit phase, which pretty much looks at, again, the adverse impact. Then they go through what they call stress testing. They do both what's called algorithm tracing and scenario tracing. Algorithm tracing is they would put in data that would, for example, that has information on protected class and see what the outcomes are when you feed in data that might lead to bias. Scenario testing is a little different as I understand it. Scenario testing, you put in very unusual cases. So you put in cases that are outside the normal range of data you would get, and you see what happens when the algorithm has to deal with sort of what you call unusual data, or data outside the normal distribution of range of data. As I understand it, that's what scenario testing is. You test sort of the limits of the AI by putting in data it might not expect to see. And then finally, they look at the algorithmic transparency and explainability. So is the algorithm transparent? Can people understand the algorithm? Can you explain it to people? Can you explain how your algorithm is working to people? That's the DCI approach. Yes?
What tends to happen with the scenario testing? Like, does it just break the system, or does it actually do anything useful? Is that like the point to find that?
I think that's the point, to see at what point the system would sort of break. It's sort of like regression, right? I mean, if you go back to Dennis guys, I mean, you're taught, well, we can only have confidence in the regression equation within the data it's originally based on. If we start feeding data in that's way outside the range of the original data that went into the regression equation, what's it going to do? And so it's sort of as I understand it, I'm not an IT person. So when you get into some of this, sort of non-IO, what I regard as non-IO stuff, I don't always know that I understand it completely, but that's as I understand it, what they're doing with that scenario testing.
Feeding it outliers.
Yeah, feeding it outliers and see what happens when it gets outliers, as I understand it. So I think somebody asked this before, sort of what should we do? When should organizations be concerned? Well, they should already be concerned. They should be concerned like yesterday, because already a lot of jurisdictions are passing laws or considering similar laws. As I said, most of the laws require an independent auditor, so they should be starting to identify independent auditors who can work with them to audit their data. And they should ensure they have validity evidence. Again, probably a lot of you haven't been out there a lot in the real world, but it's amazing how many organizations, again, have tests and don't have validity evidence for their tests. So just like you should have validity evidence for your tests, you should have validity evidence for your algorithms or for your artificial intelligence. Again, in a lot of cases, that's not necessarily there. So they should make sure that they have adequate validity evidence for their AI systems. I think somebody asked about how companies are responding. I don't know that I have any great general knowledge of how companies are responding, although I've talked to a number of them. And again, it seems basically the approach is to be compliant, but again, to often refer it to legal and see what legal says. I will say too, this is an issue where it's easy for a lot of stakeholders to get involved. It's easy, especially in New York City, you saw a lot of groups coming out and arguing AI is going to be biased against my group. We need political protection. It became a big political issue. So it went on. It certainly wasn't just a scientific or HR issue. It became a political issue in terms of potential bias in AI. So what would my long-term plan be? Well, to think ahead, to put into place systems to ensure that one is compliant over the long run. I mean, neither AI or concerns about the bias in AI or fears in AI are going to go away. So if you're working for a company, or in a couple of years if you're working for a company in HR, you should be putting in place systems to make sure you're compliant and make sure you're aware of the regulations and compliant with the various regulations. What are some other issues? These are some issues that interest me. One is some of these systems actually eliminate adverse impact. So some of these systems are designed, the AI is designed to not have any adverse impact. Well, if you know the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and, well, particularly 1991, it says you can't do score adjustments of that kind. But clearly the AI is doing score adjustments of that kind. It's doing score adjustments to eliminate the adverse impact. So you can get it, you know, I don't think anyone's worried about it or asking the question other than maybe me and a few other people. But you can ask the question, is it legal for those systems to be adjusting scores to eliminate adverse impact? I don't know what the answer is. I know it's one of the things DCI looks at when they look at, when they do their audit risk system. Do you have things in there that are specifically changing your algorithm to eliminate adverse impact? So you probably see companies that advertise. What they do is, as soon as adverse impact falls below 80% for a group, they adjust the algorithm so it's above 80%. So they're always adjusting their algorithm so the selection ratio for a group never falls below 80% of the majority group, which it's easy to tell the AI to do that, to modify your algorithm so you get rid of adverse impact. Of course, as we hopefully know, subgroup differences are not biased. But that's a difficult message to get across. What if the criterion is biased? I don't think many people have given much thought to that. I mean, it's a classic question in psychometrics. We assume, for bias analysis to work, we have to assume the criterion is not biased, or at least is less biased than the predictor. But what if the criterion is biased, in particular is heavily biased? Then what happens? You know, it's just something we don't necessarily give thought to, but it spills over into the AI space. Well, again, this relates back to one, is that what happens if the AI takes into account the protected class and improves the results so that it always seems fair? And you can argue, I guess that's a good outcome. I mean, I think people do argue that is a good outcome from AI. Okay, that's the end. That's, I think I got right about in time. Yes, I did. So other questions that you might have?
That's you up here.
That is me up there. Yes, a very old picture now of me up there.
Is it down in Florida or something?
A Gatorland Zoo. Yes, it's not a real. This is like where the gators are right over here, but that's not a real gator.
Oh, I thought
But it's at Gatorland.
I always thought it was, Dennis,
Yeah,
okay?
it's at Gatorland Zoo. Though.
I always thought it was, that's so funny. I know.
For context, this was in all of his slides when he was
Right,
teaching.
yeah, right.
It was a picture that hung on his wall.
I did have a
So I was like,
picture
oh, there
on
it
the
is,
wall.
there it is. I've been missing it, Dennis, I really have.
All right, so other questions? Any questions you have? Follow-up questions? Anything? Go ahead.
So how do you feel about AI being used to eliminate bias in recruitment specifically? So there are some companies where they're basically taking job descriptions that have biased language and editing them, just changing a couple of words around without changing like exactly what the job description is asking for, and using that to like target like recruitment from minority populations. So
Yeah.
what do you think about that application?
Well, I mean, you can ask that question in different ways. I mean, technically, again, it's probably why I said something about recruitment in the beginning. Technically, targeted recruitment is not prohibited by the Civil Rights Act. So in terms of, we're talking about the United States, you can do targeted recruitment. There's no law against targeted recruitment. Now, however, like when we go back to that situation with the older adults with the tutoring company, but then what if you then actually put in a screen to screen out certain people in addition to altering your recruitment measure, your recruitment method. So we can certainly do a recruitment method that is targeted at diverse groups, that's targeted at young people rather than old people or older individuals. The law doesn't really say you can't do targeted recruitment. Now, if you were to, and I'm not a lawyer, but if you were to lacking in subtlety, they might come after you in terms of your recruitment efforts. But recruitment is not covered at all by the uniform guidelines, and it's probably not covered at all by the Civil Rights Act. So you can do, I mean, if you're just talking about the law, you can certainly do all the targeted recruitment you want to. There's probably certainly a place for targeted recruitment. So I do a lot of work with safety forces, fire and police. I mean, you're never going to get enough minority and female applicants unless you do targeted recruitment with minorities and females for safety force jobs. So I don't know if that was your question, but I can understand why you would design, you'd use AI to design systems to particularly go out after underrepresented groups. And again, technically, under the laws that exist in the United States, that's not illegal to target protected classes during the recruitment phase.
Thank you.
That's why you can argue it's encouraged, I guess. Anything else in this? Go ahead.
So I know this is dealing mostly with companies and organizations, but in our selection class, we talked a lot about like grad school applications and admissions. Have you seen anything about using AI for graduate school, or is that just still kind of not like grad school selection decisions, like selecting grad students?
Yeah. I'm sure you'll see it. I have no doubt you'll probably see it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if people have discussed it in terms of education in particular. I think in the educational arena, the bigger concern has been with testing, right? I mean, with elimination of the GRE, elimination of the SAT, et cetera, so elimination of standardized tests. But of course, as people point out, if you eliminate standardized tests, you still have to have some way to select, unless you're going to select at random. So you have to have something. I think though, there used to be a person here at Akron who was an expert in this, right? I mean, I think a lot of the essays that you write, whether it be on the SAT or GRE, are scored by artificial intelligence. Yes. So they use artificial intelligence to score those essays, all the essays that are written. But I have to admit, I don't know a lot about that.
Sorry, I was just curious.
So Dennis, everybody here knows that we start with the job analysis, right? We start with the job analysis because then we say these are the things that matter for the job.
Right.
These are the things that matter for the job. We have those KSAOs, right? And then when we develop a selection test, right, we're kind of like, these things predict those things, right? These things are connected, which means we're talking about a lot of things, right? And people are kind of like, why did I hire Megan, right? And I was like, well, because I need somebody that can do this, 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 and this. And Megan scored here, 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 and here, and that's a good fit, basically. I mean, when I try to explain selection to kind of people in general, I'm like, that's what we're kind of going for, right? So I'm talking about these characteristics because I know something about them, and I seem like I know what I'm talking about, right? This is why did you hire Megan? She got the highest score.
Right.
What made Megan special? Beats the hell out of me, right? Isn't that what we got?
That's right, exactly.
So is that really going to be where we are? When we think about selection, that now it is back to this, I don't know why it chose Megan over Rose. I don't know, but it liked her better, and yay. And I mean, at some point, don't you think in the legal system there will be if you don't know what it is, why are we talking about it? Or do you think that it's just a matter of as long as they can show validity? I mean, if they don't have a validity coefficient, isn't this going to fall apart in court?
Did you want to say something?
I was just say it reminds me of biodata.
It is exactly this, of
Same-
empirically
same
key
criticism of
biodata. And it was excoriated for good reason of being the Dust Bowl empiricism, right? That it predicts and you don't know why. And we were all like, that is not who we are. Agree, right? Absolutely agree. So as a biodata person, we develop biodata measures of conscientiousness, right? We did a construct-oriented approach for that very reason, right? So it was just personality stuff, just a little bit more behavioral, that's it. Because the Dust Bowl empiricism of just feed it into the regression analysis, and let it go eeny, meeny, miny, mo on the items, that gives you the best validity coefficient, so that's how I'm gonna score it, right? And we defeated that as IO psychologists as being wrong, right? And really not being something that we could walk into a legal setting and in any way defend for good reason, because we didn't know what it was that was actually making us say, I think Megan is going to be the better candidate. How is this not walking us right back there?
Well, I think it is, but I mean, again, if you just look at current trends, and that's where I'd go back to my original 4 uses. I mean, say you say application blanks. I think there people are going to say, well, they don't care. They get lots of applications. They just want to screen them very fast and move the person to the next stage. And if they can explain it or not, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying what I think people are saying. So the interviewing. Now, the interviewing is sort of still based on constructs, but it's clear people liked the get the human element out of interviewing and just make it totally AI based. Although again, that was probably one of the earliest ones where they got kickback from the government and the public about you have to give people an opt out. You know, what if someone's African American, or what if someone's a non-English speaker, or what if someone's disabled? How's the AI going to score them accurately? And so there were all these concerns with the interview. Now, when you're moving to assessments, I think the approach most organizations are taking is sort of a combined approach. So, or at least most testing firms, except, and I don't want to get into naming testing firms except for one, but that their approach is generally to combine sort of the traditional approach. We'll do job analysis, we'll identify constructs, we'll develop traditional tests, but then we're going to use algorithms to score the tests. So the algorithms will score the tests. Right. You know, sort of like using regression to come up with a computational formula to score the test. The AI will, if not score the test, combine the tests, come up with the weights and the combination of the tests, but it's still sort of a traditional testing approach.
Right. So you know, and that makes sense, all right? And so all that means is that instead of me playing around with regression to go, here's my best combination of things to get a good R squared, right? And this looks good. Okay, good. That's generally how we do that. I'm going to let it just crunch, which means it can do 3-way interactions of variables, and it can do just anything it wants to kind of create basically a maximum prediction, right? The problem with that, as anybody who's ever played around with just basic regression, let alone kind of bigger models like that, is that they're incredibly unstable, all right? That factor structure thing going around, all right? You really need to replicate in order to get these types of complexities to replicate. Otherwise, you're just basically capitalizing on sample-specific kind of variance, all right? So it was Megan's lucky day, right? It still ends up being potentially Megan's lucky day if she got hired based on that algorithm, and I'm going to keep using that algorithm in perpetuity, but that was really kind of a fluke. So I think as these equations and algorithms just get more and more complex, is that not part of the conversation, that they also are very unreliable and unstable? Or do they just have such large data sets that they just think they're just kind of getting around that?
Well, I think that's part of it, that eventually that has such large data sets that they get around.
Eventually.
But I think it answers your question, sort of like what Jim was saying before. I mean, you got to remember there's sort of 2 ways they do it too, which the one I was on a panel where they were arguing, the more common is that they'll have the system learn and then they'll freeze it. Mm-hmm. So then they'll use it for quite some time, that frozen system. So then you can collect more data.
And cross-validate.
And you can figure out what it's actually doing. But the other, which some companies use, is that it's continually learning, or learning maybe not continually, but every day. Every day it learns and changes the, algorithm again. So in that case, you're never really going to know what it's doing. You're never going to just have be able to say, well, we can see if that algorithm is valid because it keeps changing. Or at least that's how I would look at it, but I'm not an IT person. IT person again might say, well, the proof is in the pudding. The fact you can predict outcomes shows that it works. I mean, even before the big AI thing, I know that's, you know, when we were working years ago with that testing organization, their IT people would argue that, you know, Winfred and I didn't have to know how the system was actually working, you know, that, because it had to be accurate, because it was based on the data.
So selection then is becoming just an engineering feat and is no longer science.
For some, I mean, you're asking the wrong person.
No, I'm asking the exact right person. I know exactly who I'm asking, all right? I'm asking a selection researcher long
You're making me play devil's advocate, but.
Of course, Dennis. This is the fun part. I've been looking forward to this all day.
I mean, again, I would say that, you know, it depends if you're taking an IT or an IO focus.
IT doesn't have science, Dennis, and you know that. It doesn't have science, it has technology.
They've discovered IO, though. They have discovered they did discover IO. So.
You know, Dennis, the very fact that you are willing to be a little defensive is a good answer.
Well,
right? So I appreciate that. I appreciate that. All right.
Well, because again, it comes down to, are you going to be able to stop it, right?
That's a different issue.
Regardless of what we feel, are you going to be able to stop AI from moving forward? These, you know, these things from, you know, just continually advancing.
So I guess my point is, sitting here with this group of people, all right, in a room that you know very, very well and have taught a group that looks exactly like this for decades. If that's where it goes, isn't it out of our hands? Do we need to keep teaching them about how to create a good selection test?
Well, that's a different question, right? Because, I mean, that even comes back to, I mean, I don't know if you remember, Walmart came to court years ago and wanted to get rid of job analysis and replace it with AI. You know, and certainly there's arguments that, you know, people that argue, well, AI can do job analysis better than humans can, you know, and things like that. So, I forget. I think your question was, will it change the way probably what we're doing? Yeah, I'd say yes. But I mean, if you look at it, all these at least for the short term, these regulations certainly create jobs for assessment firms and for individuals, because the government is saying, look, the uniform guidelines still exist, the SIOP principles still exist. You still have to comply with those principles, with those laws when you're developing these AI systems. So I don't think from that perspective, if you're saying, does it hurt the job market for IO? No, it may even continue to expand the job market for IO. But
certainly in terms of adverse impact analysis, they're going to need everybody in this room, all right, to kind of do that.
Right.
But, you know, it doesn't sound like, when I kind of spend a lot of time trying to teach people about test and measures, right, and what makes a reliable test and what makes a valid test, well, that just became moot, did it not?
Well, that's going to be interesting to see. That's going to be interesting to see.
Now we're ready to go drinking. Now I've got it rubbed up, I'm ready. Okay?
Because again, I mean, I don't think it's as advanced as far yet, but I mean, certainly there's a lot of work on automatic item creation.
Yeah.
And that, you know, AI could just sit there creating items all day long. I mean, right now you can ask ChatGPT to create a test and it'll create a test, so.
But, I mean, you know, before ChatGPT, as humans, we were held to a standard of being able to demonstrate its reliability and validity, right? That was, but ChatGPT and, you know, these AI firms and IT people, they don't have to live by those rules.
They would probably argue they don't. But I mean, again, I think it comes back to, you know, the government keeping us in business, because I think I mean, clearly right now the government is still saying which may be overly limiting, right? But they're still saying, we have these uniform guidelines that were developed pretty much in the late 60s, early 70s, that, have been outdated for a long time, but we still have these uniform guidelines, and they should apply to your AI selection and your AI testing. And so, that you still have to apply these principles. And, if you read I think some people were critical of it. I'd probably be one of those of, PSYOP statements so far in AI. But I think PSYOP statements so far in AI have basically been, well, you should follow the uniform guidelines and you should follow our PSYOP principles. Well, that's nice to say. I'm not sure, that's going to be that's a complete answer, a suitable answer to all the firms out there looking at AI selection methods. But I would say too, I think going back and just, most of the companies that I'm still familiar with, and anybody else out there, if there's a few out of the virtual audience working at consulting firms now, they're still taking a pretty traditional approach to testing. There's one or two exceptions that I know of, but most of them are still taking a pretty traditional approach to testing and still doing pretty well taking that traditional.
That construct-oriented kind of approach.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Interesting, okay. Well, we ready to drink? I am. Because, the only thing better than arguing with Dennis is arguing with Dennis over drinks, all right? That's when it gets really fun, right? Dennis, thank you so very much.
Where are we going?
Missing Falls, do you know where that is?
Misty Falls.
Missing. Do you know where Oro Shays is?
Right across the street.
If you go down Main Street, you go past the old Goodyear building there. The spaghetti warehouse on the right.
You don't need the Goodyear.
One dead company, another dead company. Fire site. The Akron, looked at me like